dukkha. Usually translated as suffering, but suffering as an English translation only works if we understand it in the broadest possible sense. Not just physical and mental pain, but dissatisfaction, frustration, dis-ease. I guess that's the one I like, dis-ease. And the Buddha himself emphasized that that's really all that he had to teach, was dukkha and how to end it. That is to say, understanding what our fundamental dis-ease is and where it comes from, and how it is that we can actually end it. If you're familiar, if you've done much reading in Buddhism, you've probably come across the Four Noble Truths, because that's often the way that his teachings are summarized. They're all about dukkha, right? Our lives are dukkha. The cause of dukkha is craving. The end of dukkha is nirvana or enlightenment. And then the Noble Eightfold Path is the path that we follow to end dukkha. So clearly this is at the heart of the Buddha's teaching. But he talked about different types. It's really important that we understand where he's coming from here. Dukkha means that even those of us who are relatively healthy and wealthy, which may be all of us here, experience this fundamental something that keeps gnawing away at us, that keeps us from being as happy as we would like to be or as happy as we think we should be. We tend to think that if we can just solve all our problems and get everything we want, that we will be happy. And the Buddha's way of talking about dukkha, what he's emphasizing is that wouldn't work. It's the nature of our minds, the way that they usually work, to be bothered by something. And even if we solve all our big problems and we've only got a small problem, it's like we will blow that up and become bothered by that. But the Buddha distinguished different types. Like one type is what you might think of as suffering, basic physical, mental discomfort, including things like some subtle ones, like being separated from somebody that you really want to be with. That's a kind of dukkha. And also being stuck with someone that you don't want to be with, in a situation that you don't want to be there. That's also a kind of dukkha. That's all the first type. The second type is dukkha due to impermanence, which is another fundamental Buddhist teaching, that everything is changing all the time. Which means that even when you're eating, I don't know if you all like ice cream, even if you're eating an ice cream cone and it's your all-time favorite flavor, mine is coconut, what's yours? Whatever. Even if it's your all-time favorite and you've got a big double scoop of ice cream, right? Even when you're eating that, there's a kind of subtle dukkha built in, because we know while we're eating it that it's going to come to an end, right? And even if you have lots of money and can buy another double scoop of coconut ice cream, there's only so much coconut ice cream you can eat before the yuck factor, it's like. So there's a fundamental dissatisfaction even built into the satisfaction of our desires. In some ways, though, I think the best example, I don't know if that's the best word to use, the best example, the worst example is our mortality. That even in our daily lives as we're living, we're aware, all too aware usually, that we're mortal, that we're going to die sometime. And sometimes this is like a kind of something perching on our shoulder that keeps whispering in our ear, and it keeps us from being able to fully enjoy our lives now, because we know that they're going to come to an end. So that, I think we can see that as a kind of dukkha. Hey, guess what? All of us in this room, we're going to die. And everyone we know and love is going to die. And that's a kind of dukkha. But it's the third kind of dukkha that I want to focus on. And it's the dukkha due to something else that the Buddha emphasized, the dukkha due to non-self or no self. Because one of the Buddha's most essential teachings, if it's not easy to understand, is the claim that there's no self. I mean, one way to say it is that our usual experience of ourselves, the feeling that I'm sort of in here, I don't know where, maybe behind my eyes or inside my ears, that I'm in here and the world is out there and we're separate from each other. That's the way I think we can understand this third claim, that the sense of separate self, the sense that there's a me that's separate from all of you, and that therefore my well-being is separate from your well-being ultimately. That this is one of the fundamental types of dukkha. There's a dukkha, a real dis-ease built into this delusion of separate self. And that's the one that I want to talk about this evening, because I want to sort of tease out some of the implications of that, which explains that strange title. What is it? Money, sex, fame, karma. I think if we really understand what the Buddha is pointing to here, I think it gives us a lot of insight into why it is we are preoccupied or obsessed with a lot of the things that we usually are. I think his perspective can really give us insight into a lot of our motivations, right? So what does it mean to say that there's no self? I mean, that's not easy to understand. I mean, the sense of self seems to be the most obvious thing of all, right? And yet, in the modern world, there's a lot of things that have happened that can give us some sense of what the Buddha was pointing at here. In particular, the whole field of developmental psychology. You know, what we know now about child development and how that works, right? I mean, babies are not born with a sense of self. That's something that develops, and there's certain types of stages that people have discovered. And not only, and in order for those stages to actually work out, you need other people, like caregivers, often say mom. You need other people who have a sense of self, because if a baby isn't surrounded or doesn't have other people around that have a sense of self, the baby will never develop a sense of self. This is what's really interesting. I'm thinking, for example, like there are these famous stories in Europe about wolf boys. You know, you might have heard about some of them. So maybe the parents die and the child is suckled by wolves or something. But the point is, if the child is not recovered very soon, certain important developmental stages will be lost, and that child will never internalize the sense of self that we all have, will never be socialized, and will never be fully human. Because to be fully human is not just biological, you have to be socialized, right? So as we grow up, a very important part of that process is sort of mom, let's say it's usually mom, she looks into our eyes and she says, David, and sort of, I internalize my sense of who I am from the way she relates to me, you know? We all do this. And as we get older, though, we tend to take it for granted. That's just who I am. That's just what I am. Not realizing that the sense of self we have is a psychological and social construct. That's what I think the Buddha's pointing at here. And what Buddhism is emphasizing is that it's not just a construct, but it's a problematical construct. No problem. That's no problem. No problem. So this construct that we have, this is what's interesting, and maybe this is what distinguishes Buddhism from a lot of developmental stuff in sort of Western psychology. The Buddha emphasizes really strongly, I mean, in a way, sense of self is necessary, but in other ways, it's very problematical because it causes us a lot of dukkha. And the big question is, well, why? Where does that dukkha come from? And here, I think from Buddhist teachings, and from sort of 20th century psychology, I think we can get a really important insight into where the dukkha comes from, what the fundamental problem is. And that's what I think this is pointing to. I think this is pointing at the fundamental problem of what it means to be a self-conscious human being. And the problem is something like this. Because this sense of self, this sense of separate self that I have and we all have, because it's a construct, it means that it doesn't have any inherent reality of its own. In other words, it's a construct because my normal sense of self is simply a kind of composite built up from mostly habitual ways of thinking and feeling and acting and reacting and remembering and planning and tending. There's a whole bunch of mental processes and some physical processes. The sense of self is a result of the way that these processes work and work together and sort of interact with each other. And they are what create this sense of separation. But the problem with that is that although we have a sense of separation, this feeling of me inside, wherever that may be, it's inherently dukkha, it's inherently uncomfortable because there's nothing there. There's no reality there. There's no thing that has any being. It's just these habitual patterns of thinking and acting, you see. You could say at the very core of our being, what is there? Well, because it's a construct, if you try to peel away all these habitual patterns of behavior and thinking and get down to what the core is, when you really peel them away, it's like peeling an onion. You find to peel them away and there's kind of nothing there. And the problem is we don't like being nothing. We don't like being no thing. There's a fundamental discomfort built into that. And what I'm trying to point to here is the way that we tend to experience this lack of being, this lack of substantiality, this lack of essence, whatever you want to call it. The way that we tend to experience it is that as a sense of lack, as a sense that there's something wrong with me, something is missing, something isn't quite right about my life. And this is what I really want to focus on, because I think this is one of the secrets of life. Every single one of us, inside, we have this feeling that there's something wrong with me, something missing, something isn't quite right. But we're not aware that everyone has it. We think it's our own individual problem. I look at all of you, you seem very real to me, but somehow from inside, this feeling, something isn't right about me. I think we experience this especially strongly in adolescence, when we're sort of creating our own identity apart from the family identity. And you think how sensitive or susceptible adolescents are to their peers. They're so dependent on what their peers think of them, I mean, one of the main ways we experience this sense of lack is our incredible vulnerability to what others think about us. We're so dependent on that. So this is the way that I understand what the Buddha is getting at with this third type of dukkha, and this is the one I'm going to dwell on, is that, yeah, we have a sense of separate self. In certain ways it's good and necessary, but it's also very problematical because this sense of self is inherently shadowed by or haunted by this sense that something is wrong with me. It can come out in many different ways, right? It can come out as a sense of inferiority. I think this is big in our culture. Low self-esteem. That's a huge one for our culture. And it just seems to me that it's something that comes with being a self-conscious human being. It's like the other side of that self-consciousness is this feeling that something is wrong with me. Does this make any sense so far? I'm not saying it's easy to understand, but let me try to relate this to the Adam and Eve story, right? You all know the story, I assume, right? They eat the forbidden fruit, they get kicked out, right? When I read that story, it seems to me a kind of like a myth about the development of self-consciousness, right? Because like after they eat the apple, what happens? They become aware they're naked, they got to put on clothes and hide from God. They get this sense of self. What this suggests to me, I wonder if this sense of lack that seems to be built into the human condition, is this maybe some explanation, is this at the root of the religious impulse? Is this where religion comes from? Is religion our collective response to this, our way of dealing with this sense of lack? For example, no, I got to back up. I left out one really important thing. Where the problem really comes in here is that we don't usually realize where our sense of lack comes from. I've just explained it as just sort of inherent to the human sense of separation, right? But, I mean, in our culture, we grow up, nothing is teaching us that, right? So what happens is we tend to kind of flip it around. And this is where the great delusion comes in for Buddhism. We tend to understand what we lack as something outside of ourselves. Rather than understanding the real source of the problem, this delusion of separate self, of separation, we tend to be conditioned by our culture, by our society, to understand what it is that we lack. For example, let's go back 1,000 years, say, in Europe, in France. If you're socialized into that culture, you learn very quickly what it is that you lack. Because you've got a church that tells you sinned. That's the source of your lack. You sinned, you have original sin from what Adam and Eve did, you've got your own sins. The whole church system works to explain what it is that feels wrong about your life and gives you an explanation and a way to deal with it. If you confess your sins to the priest, go to Mass, take the Eucharist, penances, and all this kind of stuff, right? So it's interesting how that's a classic example of how I think traditional religious societies deal with their sense of lack. You go to temples, you go to churches, you feel better, at least for a while.
They capitalize on that sense of lack.
Exactly. Well, the institutions can manipulate it and profit from it as well. And Buddhism as well, by the way, if you look at the way that karma has been interpreted in Asia. Sorry?
Made females feel like their sense of lack was that they weren't men.
There you go.
That was a pretty common misconception, shall I say.
Maybe it's a little bit less now.
20th century.
Yeah. I mean, all throughout history. I suppose another example in very relevant today is the economic one, right? And this is what I'm really trying to point to here. Suppose you have a society that isn't sort of centered around religion. In other words, suppose you have a more secular society. Now, if you have a religious society, that's a way of dealing with your sense of lack. But if you have a secular society, it doesn't mean that you don't have a sense of lack. It's just you don't have that kind of explanation, right? So how are you going to understand your sense of lack in the modern world, in 21st century America? Well, how are we conditioned?
I must be using the wrong deodorant. I need an iPhone.
Unless you really need a BD BMW.
Anybody else? How are we socialized to understand what it is that we lack today?
We lack everything, come on, right? I mean, just watch TV, you'll find out how much we lack.
And we lack enough of the thing that will provide everything, right? That is to say, money. I think that's one of the first things we learn in our society is you don't have enough money. And it doesn't even matter how much money you've got, you don't have enough. Maybe if you're one of the 0.0001%ers, I don't know, but for everybody else, even them.
Trump strike you as a happy person?
There you go. There you go.
The Koch brothers, do they look like happy men?
There you go.
Most of the people most of the people I talk to, they say they lack peace of mind. They want peace of mind. And I don't really know what that means. Is it contentment? That they are not content? Is it some kind of spirituality or serenity? Or I have a hard time defining that.
Well, I'll try to say a bit more about that from a Buddhist perspective in a bit. But I guess right now we're still focusing on the problem. And then later I'll try to say something about the Buddhist solution, which is obviously connected with that. Did you want to?
Well, I was thinking a little bit about how you're saying secular society versus religious society and how they kind of overlap to some extent. In that, like in more secular society where I think maybe our Western culture is right now, socioeconomic status speaks to what you're lacking. You're lacking that tool of money. But then there's that overlay that still exists, I think, in the religious traditions, that if you're not prosperous, it must be because you're not a good enough person. If you're just a better person, if you do things, if you're less sinful, if you're less, there's so many different examples I can think of how you be, more of a quality person in a religious sense, that you would be more prosperous and God would have blessed you more.
God wants you to be prosperous, but you're not, so obviously you're doing something wrong, right?
So I see like there's kind of an overlay there.
Well, it's interesting, sociologists have pointed out, this is tied to sort of Protestantism. And I think it's very big in American culture where the whole God thing gets overlaid with success, right? I mean, there's a sense in which success, however you define it, but it's in very kind of broad terms, but success is, we've all got to be successful. There's this compulsion to be successful, whether it's financial or fame or whatever, but that's somehow what you have to be and what you have to achieve in order to fill up your sense of lack.
And just when you're talking about that externalization of that sense of lack, I think that if you are in a lower socioeconomic status, you can kind of see it as both ways, as you're lacking the money and you're lacking God's blessing, and it just kind of builds on itself that way.
And the great tragedy of all this, whether we understand it as success in the abstract, or not enough money, or not enough things that money buys, or not famous enough, or whatever, we'll get into sort of romance and sex as well. The great tragedy is if you think that having enough of those is what's going to fill up your sense of lack, you can never have enough of those. You see, you're on a treadmill. You can say all of those motivations and preoccupations are a symptom of the problem, but they themselves are not the problem. It's this externalization, always trying to find something out here, and if I just get enough of that, then I'm going to feel okay. But the whole way that I set it up, and I think this is what the Buddha was pointing at, is that simply can't work, regardless of which of those projects. Another interesting thing to say, of course, is that in a more traditional community, religious community, there's a much stronger sort of communal support. But I think in our very individualistic society, your sense of lack is yours alone, and that's your problem that you've got to deal with, and don't expect anybody else to help you. It's not about going to a church and being part of a congregation. It's your own individual problem. And so it becomes very individualistic. And you could almost say, I think, that in the United States, for example, it seems to me we have a much stronger sense of separate self, which suggests maybe we have a much stronger sense of lack.
True with the money, though, too. You want money, but because of what it represents, it could be power, it could be recognition, it could be just safety. It's the lack behind money.
Right. I mean, because money is our indispensable means to some end, and because of this sense of lack, maybe it's almost inevitable that there will be some kind of reversal to some extent And we will tend to get caught up in this symbolism of money. I mean, there's a real irony here because we think of people who love money and the things that it buys as very materialistic. But, you know, this dollar bill, in and of itself, it has almost no value. It's not just because it's only $1, but because it's just a piece of dirty paper, right? I mean, I can't eat it. Certainly wouldn't want to eat it. I can't burn it. I don't even think it burns very well. Can't sleep in it, ride in it, any of that kind of stuff. It only has value because it's a kind of agreed, legally enforced social symbol that we can exchange for anything that we want. And so there's something really neat that goes on here. So money inevitably comes to symbolize for us, because you can buy almost anything with it, money comes to symbolize the possibility of the satisfaction of all desire, right? And since the satisfaction of all desire is how we normally feel that's what's going to make us happy, money inevitably comes to sort of symbolize at some level the possibility of happiness. More money is somehow must be more happiness, right? Like Trump and the Koch brothers and that kind of stuff. To me, there's this just wonderful myth that expresses this. And I think it's a myth that we're all familiar with, but I don't know that we've thought about it in this context. The story of Midas and his golden touch. Is everyone familiar with that? Right? So he was a very famous king in ancient times who was incredibly wealthy, but he never had enough. And one time when he did a favor to some god, Dionysius, the god said, well, what would you like as a favor, as a boon? And Midas said, I would like that everything I touch turns into gold. And so he has a great time walking around, you know, turning everything in his house to gold until it's time for dinner, right? Drink some wine, ching. Eat food, ching. His little daughter runs across the room to give him a hug, ching. What's going on there? What does this symbolize? Does this symbolize how the means destroys the end in some way? The truth is, I think that myth is more true now than it was in the time when it was first taught, because in that time people sort of produced most of what they needed, whereas we're so much deeply caught up in a money economy. We're that much more dependent on it. But think about it. It's like if you think about somebody who, like drinking a good glass of wine, really expensive glass of wine. How many of us can just drink the wine, but is there this edge of, we know how much this wine costs, this tendency to reduce the value of everything to its price? Or maybe a better example, maybe buying a really high-class car. Did you say a BMW? What?
That's what she needs.
That's what she wants, huh? All right. That's what's going to fill up your sense of lack, right? But, I mean, think about it. Okay, when people get the BMWs, it's a good car. But how much of the joy of having the BMW is the pure materiality of this good car, and how much is it sort of, I'm the kind of guy who drives a BMW, and sort of impress the neighbors and impress other people.
Would it be as fun to drive it if no one ever saw you drive it?
Exactly. So my love for this BMW, does that make me materialistic? No, it's a symbol. I'm trying to fill up my sense of lack with that, and especially connecting it with, I want other people to see me. I'm really successful. I'm really special. You see, I think this is one of the primary ways in our culture, I think, in which this fundamental sense of lack that Buddhism points to has become institutionalized. Because it's not just a personal problem, If you think about it, think about our economic system, think about the advertising that you were pointing to, Doug, how we have an economic system that's built on exploiting us and encouraging us to understand the solution to our sense of lack is the next thing that we buy. It's always the next thing, because, you know, whatever you buy, it'll make you happy for a few minutes or whatever, and then you got to have something, you know, something more, right? Well, we all know how that works. And yet, the whole economic system is based on keeping us on that hedonic treadmill, as it's sometimes called, you know, playing that game. But again, I mean, we can point ecologically to the kind of environmental disaster this consumerism is causing. But from a Buddhist perspective, more essentially, what Buddhism is saying is, hey, this is not the way to be happy. This is not going to resolve your sense of lack. It's just going to be an expression, a symptom of it. You're not going to deal with the fundamental source of the problem. You know? Does this make sense? So this is how I'm trying to relate what I think is this fundamental Buddhist teaching to our society now. Let me give two more examples, and then I'll stop for a bit. One of them is fame, which is very peculiar. You know, if you go back to that peasant in France 1,000 years ago, that peasant, he wasn't, let's call him a he, but he wasn't preoccupied with becoming rich, because for very, very few people was that just an option. The money just wasn't there, especially before the New World where they got all that gold and silver. It's like the whole obsession with money that we take for granted today wasn't something that was an option for him. Likewise, fame. It's like you're born into a particular kind of status. You know, unless you're the Pope or the King or the Emperor, or maybe St. Francis, your fame is just not an option for you, right? And yet, we today are totally caught up in that. In fact, we tend to take it for granted. It's like everyone, it's just that's what it means to be human, is to want lots of money and to often want to be famous. So where does this desire to be famous come from? Can we understand that as well in the context of this sense of lack? Interesting. You know, I don't think it's coincidental that in the 20th century, when this desire to become famous becomes so important, this is also when there's kind of technological changes, so that today, think of how much of our time we spend relating to other people through screens. Either we're watching a movie, or we're watching something on TV, or email, internet. What we're actually doing now, this way of communicating, which was the standard throughout all of human history until the last generation or so, it's actually become quite rare compared to how much information, how much we're interacting, you know, with screens, with newspapers. And along with that, along with those screens, come certain people, right? We see the same people pop up in the movies, on television, politicians on screens. And they are constantly recurring, their names, their success. I don't know about you, but when I watch, say, one of the Tonight shows, not that I do very often, but you know, when you watch television, you see these people, okay? First of all, they're almost all much better looking than I am, right? They have much nicer clothes, their conversation, their jokes, more interesting than anything I have to say. Their lives seem so much more real than mine. It's like, because they're constantly being shown up to us, and because we have this sense of lack, compared to them, they seem so real. I feel, I'm anonymous, no one knows me, I feel like I'm nothing. I feel like almost like I don't exist. Can you see what I'm pointing to here is how the desire to become famous, to be recognized, to be noticed, to be hopefully appreciated by many other people, how this could be a response to our sense of lack. If only I became famous enough, then I would feel more real. I'm talking about what I sometimes call reality projects. We have this sense of unreality, and this is one of the ways in which we try to make ourselves feel more real. Sometimes I call it a lack project. This is how we try to resolve our sense of lack. But I think we can understand a lot of fame, the attraction of fame in this way. Somehow famous people, in the act of becoming famous, they become somehow more real. It's not simply that they can translate their fame into money, whatever, but somehow they have a being to them that we, being anonymous, lack. And it's fascinating to read. There's actually interesting stories about, for some people, even bad fame is better than no fame at all. What do I mean by this? I'm remembering there was a serial killer in Wichita, Kansas. I think that's where he was from. And he complained to the newspapers. He said, how many people do I have to kill before I get my name in the newspapers, or more attention from the press? I also recently read some interesting report by an FBI agent and some academic researcher. They went around interviewing people who tried to assassinate public figures, like politicians. And you would think if someone tries to assassinate a politician, it's because they really disagree with the political stance of that politician. No way. That had almost nothing to do with it. It turned out, in almost every case, once they looked into the psychology of the person, they found out that this person's life had basically fallen apart the couple years before. It's just like, marriages, jobs, whatever. It's like their lives were becoming nothing, and they had no way to sort of rebuild them, or just it didn't seem to be working out. And at some deep sense, there's still a way to become famous by killing or trying to kill. Your name will go down in history. Or, you will, even that kind of fame is better than the anonymity of being nobody whatsoever. And it's interesting that, there have been a number of psychological studies that have verified this, which is kind of horrifying, as a motivation for, serial killers and so forth. So, I think this is something else that helps us understand too. It's like, again, if money isn't the fundamental problem, it doesn't matter how much money you have, it's never going to be enough to fill up your sense of lack. And the same thing with fame. If you think becoming famous is going to somehow, you're going to feel more real, you can become famous maybe, but that ain't going to fill up your sense of lack. In other words, that's still going to be itching away at you. And I wonder if that helps explain why some people who become famous, especially if they're very young, they kind of go off the rails so completely, They just can't cope with it. It's not doing what they thought it was going to do. Becomes a big issue there. Yeah. Let me just give one more example of reality project. Romantic love. I know the poster said sex, but we'll come to that. Romantic love. Again, something else that we in contemporary society take for granted. And what do I mean by romantic love? It means that, and again, I think this is maybe more my mother's generation than now, but if only I find that other person, that person out there, sort of somewhere out in the world, there's this person. If I just find him or her, in my case it's a her, right? If I just find that her, then the problem of my life is going to be solved. It's like, right? Think of all those fairy tales. And they lived happily ever after, once they actually get together, right? So what am I pointing to here? this is another kind of myth, the notion that the way to resolve your sense of lack is to find that other person. And that's not to say that romance, etc., are not nice, they're lovely, but if you think of that as what's going to fill up your sense of lack, your marriage, your relationship is going to come, you're going to have some problems because you're placing such a burden on it that it can't fulfill it. That other person cannot fill it. It does not resolve your sense of lack just because you have a relationship, and it'll often destroy. It's very interesting, historically, we can trace the romantic myth back to the troubadours of Europe and the story of Tristan and Isolde, which is something none of us know, but we all know Romeo and Juliet, right? Right? So let me give you a different version of Romeo and Juliet and see what you think. I want to point out something about the romantic myth. Supposing when Romeo and Juliet meet, they decide to go to their parents. And the parents say, well, we don't like it. We don't like those guys. But if you really love him, it's okay. You go ahead and you get married and we'll make the best of it. Right? Now that's not in the story, right? Why not? The whole story of Romeo and Juliet and every other romantic story is the problems. It's all about the problems. Once you actually solve the problem, I mean, imagine Romeo and Juliet in this situation when they marry, okay? And what happens? Did they live happily ever after, or do they start arguing about whose turn it is to change the baby's diaper? It's like once you're actually together, more housekeeping emotions take over, and you can no longer have the illusion that that other person is going to resolve your sense of lack. That's what I'm pointing to here. That one of the great myths that we sort of learn, or maybe more my mother's generation, like I said, is the idea that if we just find that other person, all you need is love, but just that one particular person, then your sense of lack is going to be filled up. And guess what? It doesn't happen. I think a lot of us here know it doesn't mean you can't have a really good relationship, but it's really important not to place that burden of everything that's wrong in my life, all the problems, my sense of lack is going to be resolved by being with you. The expectations are probably going to destroy the relationship, right? Now, getting to the sex side of it, I said that was the romantic myth is kind of my mother's generation. She's 90 next year. I think somehow in the 60s and 70s things changed, and it's got a little bit more of a physical tinge, and there's a bit more of a sense that it's the physical. If you just find the perfect physical relationship, the person who does everything you want them to do or whatever, it's like the perfect sexual relationship is going to fill up your sense of lack. And maybe it does for a couple seconds or a couple minutes, but the fundamental problem is that ain't going to work either, right? So, and that's not to say that sex isn't wonderful and lovely too, but it's just not going to resolve, it's not going to fill up your sense of lack. Okay, let me stop there for the moment. What I've tried to suggest, what I've tried to do is sort of correlate what I think is this fundamental teaching of the Buddha, that this sense of separate self is haunted by this sense of lack, the feeling that something is wrong with me. And the way that we tend to objectify that and understand what it is out here in our culture, the way we tend to understand our sense of lack is that there's something out here that I don't have enough of. And we all have our own different versions of that, but in our culture, it tends to condition us. So, it tends to be money, consumer things, fame, and romantic or sexual, whatever. But these are ways in which we are encouraged to try to resolve our sense of lack. And the really essential takeaway from this is because they're symptoms rather than the fundamental problem, because our obsession with them is a symptom, they themselves can never resolve this deepest dukkha, the dukkha connected with this sense of feeling separate, this sense of feeling empty. Does that make any sense?